Back in 2008, the peripheral European country suffered vast housing price collapses, having seen tearaway price gains in the preceding years. Today, we consider how continental Europe, as well as Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, really do face the prospect of a real property price bubble. So let's dive on in. Now, this channel provides global macro insights and champions the importance of sound money in a world gone crazy, so please do consider subscribing. Now, during the 1990s and first half of the 2000s, Ireland enjoyed one of the longest property booms on record. In the 10 years to 2006, the average price of second homes rose by over 300%, and for new home prices, they rose by over 250%. However, after 2007, prices peaked and house prices fell by more than 50%, eventually bottoming out in 2013. Even today, residential house prices remain below their 2007 peak. Much the same story was repeated in Spain as well as in Italy and Greece, driven on by economic growth and excessively loose monetary policy and credit creation. These house price gains were facilitated by easy credit conditions, ultimately. Now, the housing markets were undone by the subsequent credit crunch that also ended the US subprime mortgage collapse. So when credit conditions tightened, house prices fell. Now, it seems that the ECB and the Bank of Canada has rigged the explosives for the core European nations and Canada. Consider UBS's Global Real Estate Bubble Index, where we can see that the most overly extended house price gains are to be found in the home of the ECB itself, Frankfurt. The city is the most vulnerable to a dramatic house price crash. Any city given a point score over 1.5 or more is a designated bubble risk, and in top spot we can see Frankfurt received 2.16, closely followed by Toronto at 2.02. All of the other cities score below the 2-point threshold, but it's vital to remember here that any score above 0.5 reflects overvaluation. Thus, globally, 21 cities have dramatically overvalued real estate prices. Now, it is surprising to see such overvaluation in continental Europe, particularly in Frankfurt and Munich. Germans have long been admired for their prudence and their intolerance towards indebtedness. So something dramatic here is really taking place. Consider that Germany within the international community has long been a producer rather than a consumer. To that extent, it has one of the strongest economic foundations, and the country's record for prudence is well known. Germany has year after year shown itself to be one of the most resilient economies in the world. They've persistently run large current account surpluses, enabling the country to export its goods and receive payment in return. Consequently, the country has maintained a stable personal savings ratio of around 10% over the course of the last 25 years. Now, this is well in advance of debtor nations such as the US or the UK. Yet residential real estate prices have risen at an average of 10% per year in Frankfurt since 2015. Such house price gains and apparent real estate speculation are distinctly un-German in their characteristics. Moreover, Munich scores highly on the bubble index at 1.84. Clearly, German real estate is greatly overvalued right now. And this should concern us all, given the precedent that was set by the ECB from 2010 onwards. Then the so-called European Troika, which consisted of the European Commission, the ECB and the IMF was called upon to help these peripheral economies and their debt crises. Now, this troika represents unaccountable bureaucrats who agreed a memoranda of understanding with the relevant governments in 3-year financial aid programs on the condition of far-reaching austerity measures to be imposed on their societies in order to cut government expenditure. In reality, the Troika was simply imposing the same devastating policies that have been previously been prescribed to countries following the Asian financial crisis and the Argentine debt crisis previously. Unsurprisingly, as even Wikipedia points out, was that it turned out, the Troika underestimated the impact of austerity policies on economic growth. Well, there's a surprise. Meanwhile, in Toronto, nearly 30% of purchases in 2021 went to buyers with multiple properties, showing that real estate investment is alive and well. In fact, over the past 3 decades, residential home prices in Canada grew at the fastest rates in the G7. The Canadian housing market only experienced a apparent speed bump following the 2008 financial crisis. This time it will clearly be different. The acceleration of prices since the last crisis is truly something to behold. Meanwhile, Steve Saretsky, a real estate expert, points out the mass scale of residential investments as a percentage of Canadian nominal GDP, which has absolutely soared, as we can see here. And so back to continental Europe, and Jan Nieuwenjuis points out in this fascinating article the real house price index, which has soared to unprecedented levels in Amsterdam. For now, more new buyers are being enticed into the marketplace, however, with the introduction of 95% government-backed mortgages here in the UK, and in Australia, the Victorian government's home buyer fund, thanks to Brendan for sending this through, where here the Victorian government explained this is a shared equity scheme, meaning that the state's financial contribution is made in exchange for a share or proportional interest in the property. As the value of the property changes, so too will the value of the state's share or interest in the property. This means the home buyer fund will share any gains in your property's value. Of course, the home buyer's equity alone will be responsible for any losses first and foremost, though. And ultimately, this appears to look like a rug pull potentially on behalf of the Victorian government. And so should the credit taps be turned off, I fear for what will be lost here, both in terms of national sovereignty and for those home buyers who are latest to the party. It is these homeowners who are most likely to suffer negative equity, i.e. where the value of their mortgage exceeds the value of their property. However, these cases are unique, and clearly much of the developed world is vulnerable. It could, of course, be all so different, as during the gold exchange standard from the 1930s through to the 1970s, governments in most advanced economies imposed credit guidance on banks. Now, this restricted mortgage lending. Consequently, property price growth remained constrained. Yet financialisation, particularly under Reagan and Thatcher, gave rise to the progressive dismantling of credit guidance and an acceleration in mortgage lending, as we can see in this fascinating chart. Now, the authors of this paper, where this chart is from, notes that over a period of 140 years, the level of non-mortgage lending to GDP has risen by a factor of about 3, while mortgage lending to GDP has risen by a factor of 8, with a big surge in the last 40 years. Of course, banks will prefer to lend mortgage credit over corporate credit, as they have been incentivised to do so by progressive Basel banking accords courtesy of the BIS. Moreover, failure to actually make good on payments by home buyers allows the bank, of course, to seize the collateral to make up the loan. What a business to be in. To create credit from nothing, charge interest on it, while if the buyer defaults, they seize a real asset. So while politicians may talk of actually increasing housing supply and building more houses, it is demand that actually faces no restrictions and no constraints. The ability to create new credit and entice new home buyers will always facilitate higher prices. And it's these higher prices which attract new buyers and perpetuate the self-fulfilling prophecy of higher real estate valuations. Yet a day of reckoning awaits. Indeed, in this excellent Money Week article, Dominic Frisby highlighted how credit acts to drive up prices of goods where finance is used. Consequently, he found the most credit-dependent goods experienced the highest price increases. And that was, of course, housing and cars, courtesy of car finance. The lesson here, though, is clear. As Frisby states, own assets of which there is a finite supply and which people use debt or cheap money, and that includes leverage, to buy. Houses, stocks, collectibles, all that stuff is going up, he says. Yet when it comes to houses, keep well away from anything overvalued and avoid excess reliance on credit from banks. Now, thanks so much for joining me. Do follow me on these alternative platforms, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.